Imagine being thrust into a battle for your life, not on a battlefield, but in front of thousands of screaming spectators. You're not a soldier, you're a gladiator, a prisoner, a slave, or sometimes a volunteer. But all of you have one thing in common: survival. Gladiators in ancient Rome didn't choose their fate. Their fate chose them. With brutal fights to the death, wild animals, and intense training regimens, the life of a gladiator was anything but glamorous. But how much of what we know is true? What was it really like to be a gladiator in ancient Rome? In this video we'll uncover the real story behind the gladiators, from their brutal training to the blood-soaked arena, and their complex place in Roman society. Today we're diving deep into the blood-soaked arenas of ancient Rome to uncover what life was really like for gladiators. From the moment they were forced into this deadly profession to their final breath in the sand-covered Colosseum floors, you'll discover the brutal training, the psychological warfare, the surprising social status, and the shocking truths that even historians rarely talk about. By the end of this video, you'll understand why being a gladiator was simultaneously the worst and most prestigious job in the Roman Empire. And trust me, the reality is far more disturbing than fiction. Gladiators came from all walks of life. Some were slaves, others criminals sentenced to fight, and some were volunteers, men seeking fame, fortune, or redemption. The most famous gladiators were often skilled warriors, but many were just ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary life. The majority of gladiators were slaves, captured during wars or sold into slavery. They had no choice but to enter the gladiatorial schools. These men, often called vernae, had little hope for freedom. They lived in harsh conditions, chained up in cells, and trained relentlessly for the arena. They were sometimes seen as property, valued for their potential in the ring rather than their humanity. Then there were the criminals. Many men sentenced to death or punishment for their crimes were given an alternative: to fight in the arena instead of facing execution. These criminals, who could range from common thieves to political prisoners, had little to no say in their fate. A majority of these men went to their deaths, either due to their lack of combat training or the sheer brutality of the arena. But not all gladiators were unwilling participants. Some men volunteered to fight in the arena for the promise of fame, wealth, and rewards. These men were known as auctorati. In the highly competitive and brutal Roman society, some sought the glory that came with victory in the arena. To them, being a gladiator was a way to escape poverty or earn a better life. For these volunteers, the promise of money, fame, and the possibility of a special place in Roman society was worth the risk. Some saw the gladiatorial games as a path to public recognition. Gladiators became living legends in Roman culture. Famous fighters were often sponsored by wealthy patrons, who provided them with better food, better weapons, and protection. These Lannistae gladiator managers cultivated their fighters' image, almost like modern-day sports managers, and helped gladiators build reputations as skilled warriors. However, even in this elite class, the danger of death was ever present. No matter how skilled a gladiator was, the arena was still a place where death could come in a single moment. One such figure was Spartacus, a gladiator who led a massive slave rebellion against Rome in 73 BC. Spartacus's name became synonymous with resistance, freedom, and the fight for justice. While he and his fellow gladiators were enslaved and forced to fight, they used their skills in the arena to challenge the Roman system. Spartacus's legacy would inspire generations of people to fight against oppression, but his story also highlighted the fine line between the gladiators' potential for glory and the brutal reality of their position in society. Gladiators also included those who were trained to fight in specific styles, Some gladiators fought with heavy armor, carrying shields and swords, while others fought with lighter armor and smaller weapons. The most well-known types of gladiators were Thracics, gladiators who fought with a curved sword Sika, and wore a helmet with a high crest. They represented the ancient Thracians, known for their speed and agility. They fought with light armor and relied on speed, agility, and the ability to entangle their opponents in the net, before finishing them off with the trident. Secutor, often paired against the rhetarius. The secutor was armed with a short sword, and wore a smooth helmet to avoid the rhetarius's net. They relied on strength and a relentless attack style. They represented archetypes of Roman virtue. Gladiators were seen as embodiments of bravery, skill and endurance. Their very presence in the arena became a symbol of Roman power and the might of the empire, where even a death in the arena could be seen as a spectacle worthy of admiration. While they might have fought under oppressive conditions, gladiators were often celebrated in art and literature. Their stories were passed down in poems, plays, and even visual art. Roman writers like Juvenal, Martial, and Seneca wrote extensively about gladiators, and while some stories were critical of the bloodlust of the crowds, others elevated gladiators to the status of heroes. These gladiators were often seen as symbols of sacrifice for the greater good of Rome. They were hailed for their courage, skill, and ability to endure the unimaginable. Many gladiators, after gaining a reputation in the arena, were able to buy their freedom, escape the brutal life they had been forced into, and live as free men. However, for the majority, their fates were sealed as mere pawns in a game that was played for the amusement of the mass. In the end, the lives of gladiators were ones of extremes: extreme violence, extreme discipline, and extreme fame. Whether they were slaves, criminals, or volunteers, all gladiators faced one thing in common: they fought for survival, often with little hope for anything beyond the next battle. Their lives were dictated by the whims of those in power, and their destinies were shaped by the needs of the empire. Training to be a gladiator was like preparing for a war where survival was the ultimate goal. Gladiators were often selected from among slaves, prisoners, and volunteers who had no choice but to enter the arena. However, the training they underwent was more than just physical. It was a complete system that focused on creating highly skilled and durable fighters, capable of surviving the brutal combat of the arena. The gladiator school, known as a ludus, was an institution where fighters spent years preparing for their moment in the spotlight. Some ludi were managed by wealthy private owners, while others were state-run and part of the Roman military system. These ludi were often surrounded by walls to keep the gladiators confined and away from the public. Inside the ludus, the atmosphere was harsh, disciplined, and demanding. The ludus was a place of constant work and little rest. Gladiators were subjected to rigorous, grueling training regimen. The training was designed to build their strength, stamina, and skills with weapons, while also teaching them how to survive a life of violence and pain. The gladiators were treated as living weapons, trained to withstand physical injury and mental torment. But not all gladiators were trained equally. The first stage of training was intense physical conditioning. Gladiators were required to build muscle mass and strength. They would be trained in endurance exercises, which included running long distances, carrying heavy weights, and performing various drills to increase their stamina. These exercises ensured that they could endure the long and brutal hours of combat in the arena. But physical conditioning wasn't enough. Gladiators were also taught the art of combat. They learned how to fight with specific weapons, and each type of gladiator had a distinct fighting style and weaponry that suited their persona. The Murmillo, for example, fought with a short sword, gladius, and a large shield, scutum, and they were heavily armored. They had to be able to withstand powerful blows while attacking with precision. The Retiarius was the light gladiator, relying on agility, speed, and the element of surprise to trap and overpower his opponent. This type of gladiator was trained to be quick on his feet, using his net to entangle the opponent before striking with his trident. The Thrakes had a curved sword and wore a distinct helmet with a high crest. Their training emphasized speed, agility, and using their shield to block an attack in quick succession. Each type of gladiator's training regimen was tailored to the weapons they would use, as well as their combat style. In addition to the individual weapons training, gladiators also learned how to fight in pairs or groups. Many gladiator fights were not one-on-one duels but involved teams working together in the arena, making the training even more complex. The training often involved sparring with other gladiators in mock battles, but these mock fights were no light-hearted practice. They were as close to the real thing as possible. The gladiators would fight with real weapons, sometimes even sharp ones, which meant that injuries were common. Many gladiators suffered severe wounds during training, and some died before ever stepping foot in the arena. The gladiators were also taught to be strategic in their combat. They learned to read their opponent's moves, look for weaknesses, and use their environment to their advantage. Fights weren't always straightforward battles. Gladiators had to be adaptable. They learned how to use the terrain, the presence of other fighters, and even environmental factors, such as the time of day, to gain an upper hand. But the most grueling aspect of their training was the mental preparation. Gladiators had to develop the psychological resilience to face not only the dangers of the arena, but also the emotional toll of constant violence. Fear and pain were constant companions for most gladiators. They were trained to face the terror of potential death and to focus on survival rather than the inevitability of injury. Some gladiators were trained in psychological warfare, learning how to intimidate their opponents or play to the crowd's emotion. The gladiators had to become masters of their own fear and doubts, learning to fight through exhaustion and despair. Training in the ludus wasn't just about skill, it was about survival tactics. Gladiators had to learn to endure not only the punishment of the combat, but also the humiliation of being treated as property. They were constantly reminded of their position as slaves, and their mental toughness was tested daily. Gladiators were often punished severely if they didn't meet expectations or didn't perform well in training. Failing to impress could mean a beating, isolation, or even more extreme punishment. A crucial element of gladiator training was the development of endurance and the ability to recover quickly from injury. Injuries were inevitable in a gladiator's life, both in training and during fight. The human body could only take so much punishment, so gladiators were trained to heal quickly and continue fighting. Some gladiators had access to better medical care than others, and some even had personal doctors who would assist with treating wounds. However, this didn't guarantee that the gladiator would survive. Many died from infection or trauma from the brutal nature of their wounds. In addition to physical and combat training, gladiators were also trained in spectacle and showmanship. They were taught how to engage the crowd, to fight with flair, and to perform for the audience. The Roman people didn't just want blood, they wanted drama. They wanted excitement, skill, and art in combat. Gladiators were encouraged to show their prowess in ways that entertained the crowd. The most famous gladiators were those who captured the public's attention with their charisma, their style, and their ability to survive. Some gladiators even had personal trainers, experts who specialized in particular fighting technique. They were given rigorous schedules and special attention to ensure that they reached their full potential. The highest level of gladiators often came from this category, as they were considered elite warriors in their field. The training wasn't only about combat, It also involved learning to survive mentally and physically in a world where your life was at the whim of others. A gladiator's success was largely determined by their skill in combat, but it was also influenced by their ability to withstand the brutal conditions of the arena and the harsh realities of life as a slave. The gladiators' lives in the ludus were dictated by strict discipline and routine. After long hours of training, gladiators were allowed little leisure, and their social lives were restricted. They were constantly monitored, living under the constant threat of punishment or death. But the promise of glory, and sometimes freedom, pushed them forward. For some, the hope of victory in the arena was the only escape from a life of suffering. The gladiatorial training system was an unforgiving machine, designed to produce warriors who were capable of surviving and thriving in the most violent arena the world had ever known. Gladiators were forged through blood, sweat, and unyielding determination. Their training was brutal, but it was their only chance for survival. The Colosseum in Rome, the largest and most iconic of the arenas, could hold up to 80,000 spectators. But it wasn't just about fighting. The arena was a place for public entertainment, and the gladiatorial games were designed to showcase the strength, courage, and skill of the fighters. These games were often part of a larger celebration, such as a political campaign, military victory, or religious festival. The Roman emperors and elite used these events to solidify their power, gain favor with the people, and celebrate the might of the Roman Empire. The gladiatorial games were more than just violent spectacles. They were a massive form of social control. These brutal events were a way to keep the masses entertained and distracted, preventing unrest while reinforcing the idea that life itself was cheap and expendable. To the crowd, the gladiators were just pawns in a grand performance, disposable but essential for the theater of violence. Each fight was carefully organized, and the gladiators were matched based on their skill levels, combat style, and experience. Gladiators were not randomly thrown into the arena. The matches were planned by the lanistae, gladiator managers, who would assign specific gladiators to certain opponents in order to create the most exciting and dramatic fight possible. This element of the spectacle was critical to the success of the games. The Roman audience wasn't just interested in bloodshed. They wanted to see a dramatic contest where skill, strategy, and sometimes even personal vendettas played out before their eyes. Some of the most iconic and well-known battles were one-on-one duels, where two gladiators fought with weapons and armor. But the spectacle wasn't limited to just these. At times battles involved multiple gladiators, with groups of men pitted against each other in chaotic free-for-all contest. These were the most dangerous and unpredictable battles, and while they could entertain the crowds for hours, they also resulted in much higher casualties among the fighters. Beyond the human opponents, gladiators often faced wild animals, such as lions, tigers, bears, and even elephants, in what were known as venationanas, animal hunts. These battles were a favorite form of entertainment for the Roman crowds, showcasing the dominance of human warriors over fierce creatures from across the empire. Gladiators armed with only spears, tridents, and nets were expected to battle these animals in highly orchestrated confrontation. These animal hunts were often part of the grander spectacle and would draw crowds from all walks of life, with the animals themselves often being exotic and dangerous. However, human versus animal battles were not the norm for every gladiator. The majority of gladiators fought against other men, and these one-on-one duels were seen as a true test of strength, skill, and willpower. The nature of these battles meant that not every fight ended in death. While the idea of the fight to the death has often been romanticized, many gladiators survived their matches and lived to fight another day. The decision of whether a gladiator would live or die was typically made by the editor, the official in charge of the games, who could be the emperor or a wealthy patron. The crowds, however, often had significant influence over the final decision. The Roman public could sway the editor's choice with their roars, chants, and gestures. If a gladiator fought well and earned the respect of the audience, they could receive the signal to be spared, a gesture known as pollice verso, where the editor would either give a thumbs up to spare or a thumbs down to condemn the fighter. This symbol, however, is widely misinterpreted today. Roman historians suggest that the thumbs down gesture actually meant thumbs up for death, and the thumbs up gesture was actually for sparing. In either case, the fate of a gladiator often rested in the hands of the crowd. A brave, skilled fighter might earn mercy, but a weak or unlucky fighter was likely to be killed regardless of how hard they fought. Despite this chaotic life-or-death environment, some gladiators enjoyed fame and even a certain level of celebrity. Popular gladiators like the famous Spartacus, or even less-known figures who had amassed victories, often earned a kind of legendary status. They were celebrated by the people of Rome, with fans supporting their favorite fighters in the same way modern sports fans support athletes. These gladiators were seen as heroes, and for some, surviving in the arena could lead to unimaginable fame. But this fame came at a great cost. Gladiators could only enjoy their success for a short time, with many falling in later matches due to injuries or the sheer brutality of the arena. The arena was more than just a stage for combat. It was a psychological battleground. Gladiators faced not only the physical threat of death, but also the emotional trauma of fighting for their lives. The tension in the arena was palpable, with fighters often feeling the weight of their own mortality with every swing of their weapon. Gladiators had to maintain a mental focus, blocking out the fear and fatigue, while simultaneously engaging in the strategic thinking required to defeat their opponent. Some gladiators used tactics and psychological tricks to outwit their opponent. They would feign injury to lure their opponent into a vulnerable position, only to strike with sudden speed. Others would focus on outlasting their opponent, using their superior endurance to gain the upper hand in the latter stages of a match. It was not just about brute force. The ability to read your opponent, anticipate their moves, and exploit weaknesses was just as important as physical strength. If a gladiator managed to survive several bouts, the opportunity for manumission, the act of gaining freedom, could become a reality. This was a rare but possible outcome for the most successful gladiator. In some cases, a gladiator might win their freedom after achieving a certain number of victories, or after becoming so famous that their masters no longer wanted to risk their life in the arena. These victorious gladiators were rewarded with the ultimate prize, freedom. However, not all gladiators were so fortunate. Even after winning their freedom, many former gladiators continued to live in the shadow of the arena. Some went on to train others, passing down their skills to the next generation of fighters, while others became mercenaries, or fought in smaller, less formal contests. The fame and respect they earned in the arena would often allow them to live out their remaining years as relatively well-off citizens, but for many the trauma of the arena was something they could never fully escape. Beyond the individual contests, gladiatorial games were often part of larger public celebrations, such as the inauguration of a new emperor or military victory. The most elaborate games could include not only gladiatorial battles, but also naumachia mock naval battles, chariot races, animal hunts and executions. The sheer scale of these events reflected the grandeur of the Roman Empire. These festivals, sometimes lasting for days, were held in specially constructed arenas that could be flooded to simulate naval warfare. Gladiators were sometimes forced to take part in these mock sea battles, paddling in boats and fighting with swords while surrounded by water. These games were not only a display of the empire's power, but also a tool for political control. By holding extravagant games and keeping the masses entertained, Roman leaders ensured their popularity and loyalty from the common people. The games acted as a form of bread in circuses, providing free food and entertainment to the public in exchange for their allegiance. Ultimately, the arena was a place of life and death, of fleeting glory and brutal sacrifice. Gladiators were both victims and victors, pawns in a greater game that spanned the entire Roman Empire. Whether fighting for their freedom or their survival, every gladiator's fate was decided by the brutal rules of the arena, where the only certainty was that death could come at any moment. Despite their violent and brutal lifestyle, gladiators played a significant role in Roman society, and their presence in the empire was complex. Gladiators were both celebrated and despised, simultaneously revered as symbols of Roman virtues like bravery, endurance, and sacrifice, yet often seen as little more than expendable commodities used to entertain the masses. Understanding how gladiators fit into the fabric of Roman life reveals not only the harshness of their existence, but also the societal values that underpin their role. At their core, gladiators represented the paradox of Roman society. The empire, which prided itself on civilization and culture, was built upon violent spectacles and the exploitation of human life for entertainment. This paradox played out in the arenas, where men were forced to fight for their survival, but also glorified as heroes or tragic figures depending on their fortunes and the public's perceptions. Gladiators as symbols of Roman virtue. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves or criminals, were celebrated in Roman culture as exemplars of the core values that defined Roman identity: strength, endurance, bravery, and honor. The gladiatorial games themselves were steeped in symbolism, reflecting the Roman ideals of virtue, manliness, glory, and pietas, duty, loyalty. These values were central to Roman society, and gladiators, by risking everything in combat, were seen as embodying them. In the eyes of the public, gladiators were both figures of admiration and fascination. Their willingness to face death for the entertainment of others was seen as a form of ultimate courage. They were often depicted in art, literature, and theater, where they were celebrated as warriors who sacrificed their lives in the name of Roman grandeur. These glorifications were not without contradictions, however. Although celebrated as symbols of courage and sacrifice, gladiators were still slaves or criminals. Their heroism was framed within the context of their exploitation. The gladiatorial games themselves, often staged for the masses, were not only about entertainment but also about reinforcing these Roman ideals. The games were a public display of power and discipline, intended to demonstrate the might and order of the empire. Gladiators as participants were not only warriors but also performers in a grand societal ritual. The status of gladiators, heroes, or expendable commodities. The status of gladiators in Roman society was highly contradictory. On one hand, they were revered by the public, and some of the most successful gladiators achieved celebrity status. On the other hand, they were treated as little more than property, their lives valued only in terms of the spectacle they could provide. Most gladiators were slaves, forced into combat against their will, with little to no chance of escaping the violence of the arena. These men had little agency over their fate. They were often owned by lanistae, the gladiator trainers and managers, who treated them as investments to be maintained, trained, and sold. As property, gladiators had no legal rights, and their lives were entirely at the discretion of their master. If a gladiator survived long enough, they might be granted freedom, but this was an exception rather than the rule. However, some gladiators, especially those who volunteered to fight in the arena, gained a different status. Volunteers, or octocrata, were free men who chose to fight for fame and fortune, but they were still subject to the same brutal treatment as slaves. For these men, the prospect of glory, wealth, and freedom was enough to motivate them to risk their lives in the arena. Many of these volunteers having achieved success, gained a reputation that could elevate them to celebrity status within Roman society. Despite the fame they could achieve, however, gladiators were ultimately disposable. Their value to society was tied directly to their ability to fight, and once that ability was gone, whether through injury, aging, or simply the whims of the editor, the organizer of the games, they were no longer of use. Gladiators' fates were often sealed in the arena, where their survival was as much a matter of luck as it was of skill. Gladiators and popular culture. Gladiators were not just icons in the arena, they were also deeply embedded in Roman popular culture. Their stories were widely known and often romanticized in literature, art, and even theater. Writers and poets like Juvenal, Martial, and Seneca wrote about the gladiators, often focusing on their roles as tragic figures caught in a system they couldn't escape. The gladiatorial ethos, that fight for survival and glory, permeated Roman cultural expressions. Gladiatorial combat was a central theme in Roman entertainment. These events were often used to commemorate military victories, celebrate political events, or commemorate the lives of emperors. The gladiators were stars of the show, their actions, successes, and failures watched by tens of thousands of spectators. To the crowds, they were not just slaves or criminals, they were warriors. Their victories were celebrated, and their defeats mourned. These figures were also frequently immortalized in Roman sculptures and mosaics. Statues of famous gladiators, victorious in combat, could be found in public spaces, museums, and private homes. Their likenesses were often cast in bronze or carved in stone, depicting them in dynamic fighting poses or showcasing their trophies. These sculptures reinforced the gladiators' status as both fighters and cultural icons, blurring the lines between warriors and heroes. The presence of gladiators in Roman society wasn't just about entertainment. It was also a tool of political power. The emperor and the elite classes used the gladiatorial games to gain favor with the people. By hosting lavish games, emperors could demonstrate their wealth, power, and generosity, while also placating the masses and preventing unrest. The panem circusans, bred in circuses, philosophy was deeply embedded in Roman society, where the provision of food and entertainment was used to keep the people distracted and content. The games themselves were frequently used as a form of propaganda. By providing extravagant shows of violence and spectacle, emperors like Titus and Trajan showcased their military victories, cementing their reputations as powerful and benevolent rulers. Gladiators therefore played a key role in the political landscape, acting as tools to maintain public order and to support the emperor's authority. Freedom, fame, and redemption. Despite the grim realities of their lives, some gladiators could achieve a rare form of redemption. Those who performed exceptionally well in the arena could gain manumission, the act of being freed from slavery. The most famous gladiators, through their skill and endurance, could rise to celebrity status, achieving fame that lasted far beyond their time in the arena. These freed gladiators were often admired and respected, as they had overcome the ultimate test of survival. Some gladiators even went on to become trainers themselves, running their own ludi and passing down their skills to the next generation of fighters. These successful gladiators had the opportunity to escape the brutal world they had been forced into, and some used their newfound freedom to lead relatively comfortable lives, earning a living as trainers, managers, or even as mercenaries in other parts of the empire. Yet even those who survived the arena often had to grapple with the psychological and emotional scars of their experiences. The trauma of constant violence, the fear of death, and the degradation of being treated as property left lasting marks on many gladiators. Those who survived the arena were often left with physical and mental scars, a reminder of the brutal nature of their existence. The end of the gladiators' legacy. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, the gladiatorial games began to lose favor. Emperor Constantine, in the early 4th century, made efforts to phase out the games, but it was his successors who finally brought an end to the practice. The Christian emphasis on the sanctity of life and the growing influence of the Church were key factors in the decline of the gladiatorial games. The games, once a symbol of Roman grandeur, were now seen as barbaric and incompatible with Christian values. Nevertheless, the legacy of the gladiators lives on. Their stories of bravery, bloodshed, and survival continue to captivate the modern imagination. From films like Gladiator to novels and television series, the image of the gladiator as a tragic hero or tragic figure remains a powerful cultural symbol. Section 5. The Legacy of the Gladiators. The legacy of gladiators is both enduring and complex. While the gladiatorial games themselves eventually ceased, the impact of the gladiators and their brutal battles in the arenas left an indelible mark on Roman history and by extension on modern culture. Over time, the memory of gladiators has evolved, from the glorification of their combat skills to a critical examination of the system that exploited them. Their legacy continues to fascinate us today, making them some of the most iconic figures in history. The decline of gladiatorial combat. The gladiatorial games, which had flourished for centuries, began to decline in the 4th century AD. The rise of Christianity played a crucial role in this. Early Christians were appalled by the violent and bloody nature of the games, viewing them as morally repugnant. Christian doctrine, which emphasized the sanctity of life, stood in stark contrast to the idea of using human beings as entertainment for the mass. As Christianity grew in influence, it increasingly opposed the gladiatorial spectacles. In 325 AD, Emperor Constantine, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, made efforts to curb the gladiatorial game. The First Council of Nicaea 3025 AD, convened by Constantine, issued a decree to end the practice, marking the beginning of the decline of the gladiatorial combat tradition. However, the games continued sporadically for some time, and the last recorded gladiatorial fight took place in 4035 AD, under Emperor Honorius. Eventually, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, along with the growing dominance of Christianity, led to the cessation of the game. Despite the eventual end of the gladiatorial games, their impact on Roman society could not be erased so easily. Gladiators had become a symbol of Roman power, strength, and bravery, values that continued to shape Roman identity even after the games and the enduring cultural legacy. Even after the gladiatorial games ceased, the image of the gladiator persisted in Roman culture and has continued to resonate throughout history. Gladiators have been immortalized in art, literature, theater, and more recently in film and television. The figure of the gladiator is one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of ancient Rome. Today, the gladiator represents more than just the violent combat they participated in. They symbolize the human struggle for survival, freedom, and glory. In the centuries following the end of the games, gladiators were depicted in various forms of Roman art, from sculptures to mosaics. Their stories of courage and valor were retold in poems, plays, and other literary works. The most famous gladiators, such as Spartacus, became legendary figures whose stories symbolized the themes of rebellion, resistance, and the desire for freedom. Spartacus, the gladiator who led the largest slave rebellion against the Roman Republic, remains one of the most well-known gladiators in history. His story has been adapted into countless books, films, and television series, making him an enduring symbol of resistance against oppression. The gladiatorial games themselves were also depicted in Roman frescoes and mosaics, with many scenes showing gladiators in combat. These artworks were often intended to celebrate the virtues of Roman society, valor, honor, and discipline, while also reflecting the dark side of Roman culture, where entertainment often came at the expense of human life. The image of the gladiator has been revived and reinterpreted countless times throughout history. From the Renaissance period to modern Hollywood, gladiators have continued to capture the public imagination. Perhaps the most famous modern depiction of a gladiator is the 2000 film Gladiator, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Russell Crowe as the fictional character Maximus Decimus Meridius. The film, which won 5 Academy Awards, reignited global interest in the history of gladiators and their role in ancient Rome. The film portrayed gladiators as tragic heroes caught between the horrors of the arena and the desire for personal redemption, blending historical events with emotional storytelling. This cinematic portrayal of the gladiator as both a fighter and a tragic figure helped to shape how we view these ancient warriors today. In addition to films like Gladiator, gladiators are also prominent in video games, books, and television series. Spartacus, a TV series that aired from 2010 to 2013, brought the story of the famous gladiator to a new generation, with a mix of historical events and dramatized action. The series explored the brutality of gladiatorial combat, the relationships between gladiators, and the political intrigue surrounding their existence. It reflected the modern fascination with both the violence and heroism of gladiators. The gladiator theme has also been explored in literature, such as the novel Gladiator by Simon Scarrow, which fictionalizes the life of a gladiator in the Roman Empire. The gladiator remains an archetype for stories about survival, fighting for one's freedom, and confronting moral dilemmas in extreme circumstances. The philosophical and ethical reflection on gladiatorial combat, the legacy of gladiators, also provides us with an opportunity to reflect on the ethical implications of such spectacle. In ancient Rome, gladiators were often seen as tools of entertainment, objects of fascination and admiration, yet ultimately expendable. They were valued for their ability to fight, not for their humanity, and this attitude is deeply embedded in the cultural legacy of the game. Modern reflections on gladiators, through films and literature, have often focused on the moral and philosophical questions raised by their existence. The juxtaposition of fame and freedom, with the violence and exploitation of their lives, offers a poignant commentary on the nature of power, control, and human dignity. Gladiators were heroes to the people, but they were also victims, trapped in a system that used them as pawns for entertainment. This duality of glorification and exploitation is central to our understanding of gladiators today. In modern society, the gladiator's legacy has become a symbol not just of ancient cruelty, but also of the resilience of the human spirit. The desire to fight, to survive, and to seek glory in the face of insurmountable odds resonates deeply in contemporary storytelling. Gladiators and the symbol of strength and perseverance. Gladiators have also come to symbolize the values of strength, endurance, and perseverance. In modern usage, the term gladiator is often associated with individuals who demonstrate exceptional resolve and bravery, whether in sports, business, or other fields of endeavor. Athletes, soldiers, and others who face extreme challenges are sometimes referred to as modern-day gladiators, emphasizing their ability to endure hardships and push through adversity. In this sense, the legacy of the gladiator has transcended the confines of ancient Rome and become a universal symbol. The gladiator represents not only a violent past, but also the power of the human spirit to fight against overwhelming odds, to survive, and to strive for greatness, even when faced with death. The role of gladiators in shaping Roman identity. In the Roman Empire, the gladiators played a crucial role in shaping Roman identity and public life. The games themselves were a tool for the political elite, used to control the masses and distract the public from the empire's numerous problems. The gladiatorial games, and the gladiators themselves, became symbols of Roman power, both for the people of Rome and for the emperors who used the games to solidify their reign. The gladiatorial combat that took place in the grand arenas of Rome and across the empire became an intrinsic part of Roman culture. It was a manifestation of Roman values, strength, honor, endurance, and the glory of victory. The gladiators were not just warriors in the arena, they were a symbol of Rome's might and a constant reminder of the empire's dominance. Section 6. The legacy of gladiators in modern culture. The gladiators of ancient Rome have left a profound and lasting legacy that continues to shape modern culture. From film and television to literature, the gladiator has evolved from a historical figure into a powerful symbol, representing both human endurance and the brutal pursuit of glory. While the actual practice of gladiatorial combat has long been consigned to history, the themes they embodied, sacrifice, survival, and the conflict between humanity and cruelty, resonate strongly in the modern world. Gladiators in Hollywood. From Gladiator to Spartacus, one of the most prominent modern reimaginings of gladiators came with Ridley Scott's 2000 epic film Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe as the fictional character Maximus. The film resurrected the gladiatorial ethos for a new generation, blending historical elements with dramatic storytelling. Maximus, a general turned gladiator, seeks revenge and redemption in the bloody arena, capturing the attention of millions of viewers worldwide. His journey from slave to gladiator to hero became a template for modern action films. The movie's massive commercial success reignited interest in the history of gladiators and provided a glimpse into the brutality of ancient Roman combat. It wasn't just the bloodshed that captivated audiences, but the larger story of courage, survival, and moral reckoning. Maximus's character, while fictional, embodies the themes of oppression, resistance, and freedom, resonating with people's desires for justice and vengeance in their own lives. The popularity of Gladiator was followed by several other films and television series that continued the trend of glorifying gladiators as heroic figures. Perhaps the most notable is the TV series Spartacus, which aired from. The show chronicles the life of the real-life gladiator Spartacus, who led a rebellion against Rome and, although dramatized, Spartacus brought the lives of gladiators to a new, younger audience, portraying the battles in the arena as not only violent, but also filled with complex emotional and political drama. The series highlighted themes of loyalty, betrayal, and freedom, positioning gladiators as the ultimate symbols of resistance against oppression. Both Gladiator and Spartacus have made lasting contributions to the gladiators' place in modern popular culture, transforming them from mere fighters to symbols of resilience, defiance, and the fight for dignity in a world that often seems stacked against them. These portrayals have made gladiators one of the most enduring figures in modern storytelling. In contemporary society, the term gladiator has transcended its original meaning and has come to symbolize not just a fighter in ancient arenas, but anyone who demonstrates great strength, perseverance, and resilience. The modern-day use of the word gladiator is often seen in contexts that emphasize overcoming adversity, whether in sports, business, or personal struggles. In sports, athletes who face seemingly insurmountable challenges are often compared to gladiators. The physical demands of professional sports mirror the intense conditioning and training that gladiators underwent. Just as gladiators battled in arenas for survival, modern athletes battle in their fields for victory, often enduring pain, exhaustion, and injury to achieve their goals. The gladiator, then, becomes a metaphor for anyone who must push their physical and mental limits to succeed. One of the most famous examples of this modern-day gladiatorial comparison is the world of professional wrestling, particularly in the WWE World Wrestling Entertainment. Wrestlers are often portrayed as larger-than-life gladiators. With their matches broadcast to millions of fans around the world, they endure brutal, scripted combat in front of live audiences, playing the roles of heroes, villains, and everything in between. Just like the gladiators of ancient Rome, the dramatic flair, the heroism, and the violence of professional wrestling are all elements inherited from the ancient gladiatorial tradition. The modern interpretation of gladiators is not limited to physical combat. In popular culture, The term gladiator has also been applied to individuals fighting against societal injustices, personal demons, or oppressive systems. Activists, survivors, and ordinary individuals who battle for their rights, equality and justice, are often likened to gladiators. The resilience of those who rise above adversity, whether through civil rights movements, gender equality struggles, or overcoming personal hardship, is seen as embodying the spirit of the gladiator. Gladiators, and the evolution of fighting for freedom. One of the most enduring aspects of gladiatorial culture in modern times is the idea of fighting for freedom. For many gladiators in ancient Rome, the arena was a place of both imprisonment and potential redemption. While they were enslaved or forced into combat, gladiators who performed well in the arena could sometimes earn their freedom, either through the decision of their Laniste trainer or through the granting of manumission release by their master. This concept of fighting for freedom transcended the arena and became a central theme in modern depictions of gladiators. In films like Gladiator, the desire for freedom is a powerful motivator for the protagonist. Maximus, the central character, is initially a general of the Roman legions, but is betrayed and forced to fight as a slave in the arena. His journey is not just one of survival, but one of revenge and the hope of gaining his freedom. His story, like that of Spartacus, centers on the ultimate fight for autonomy and the right to live a life free from oppression. Modern narratives often reflect this gladiatorial theme of freedom, albeit in different contexts. From characters overcoming personal struggles or fighting against political tyranny, to activists fighting for social change, the gladiator remains a symbol of the fight for liberty. This evolution of the gladiator from a historical figure to a broader metaphor speaks to the continuing human desire for self-determination, whether it's freedom from personal constraints, societal pressures, or systems of oppression. The gladiator in video games and digital media. Another major development in the modern legacy of gladiators is their portrayal in video games. Gladiators are central characters in many video games, often as playable characters or opponents. Games like Gladiator, Sword of Vengeance, and Shadow of Rome allow players to experience the brutal world of gladiators in the arena, offering immersive simulations of gladiatorial combat, training, and survival. These games tap into the same primal appeal that ancient gladiatorial combat held for Roman audiences: the visceral excitement of combat and the thrill of emerging victorious against overwhelming odds. The gladiatorial theme in digital media has also been explored in virtual worlds, with games like Age of Empires and Total War incorporating Roman gladiators as part of their combat unit. These games allow players to experience the grandeur of the Roman Empire and the strategic importance of gladiators in the military and social fabric of the time. Video games, along with films and television shows, have made the concept of the gladiator accessible to a new generation, providing interactive and dynamic experiences that bring gladiatorial combat into the 20th. These portrayals offer players a way to engage with history, learn about the ancient world, and live out the fantasies of being a gladiator without stepping into a deadly arena. The gladiator as a philosophical symbol, life and death in the arena. At a deeper level, the gladiator remains a philosophical symbol that raises fundamental questions about life, death, and the value of human life. In ancient Rome, gladiators were often seen as commodities, their lives valued only in relation to their ability to fight and entertain. Yet over time, modern interpretations of the gladiator have shifted toward viewing them as tragic heroes. They represent the fragility of life and the struggles of the individual against overwhelming forces, be it a corrupt system, political power, or fate itself. The moral questions raised by the gladiatorial games about the ethics of using human beings as entertainment, the exploitation of labor, and the nature of freedom continue to echo in modern debate. Many modern gladiatorial stories explore the psychological toll of combat, the meaning of victory, and the existential questions surrounding life in the face of death. Gladiators are not just warriors, they are symbols of the human condition, caught between the brutal forces of the world and the desire for meaning and freedom. the lasting influence, from public spectacle to modern justice. Ultimately, the legacy of gladiators is multifaceted. It's about more than just the ancient games. It's about human struggle, survival, and the pursuit of meaning in a world that is often indifferent to individual life. Gladiators remind us of the price of entertainment, the value of human dignity, and the quest for redemption and freedom. The gladiator's legacy is far from fading, whether in films, video games, or modern political movements. The symbol of the gladiator endures as a reminder of the resilience and endurance of the human spirit in the face of brutal opposition. Section 7. The legacy of gladiators in modern society, and their influence on ideals of courage, freedom, and honor. The gladiators of ancient Rome, though living centuries ago, have deeply influenced how we view concepts of courage, freedom, and honor in modern society. Their legacy transcends the violent arena battles they fought, extending into modern-day perceptions of heroism, struggle, and personal sacrifice. Through popular culture, philosophy, and even psychology, the gladiators' influence continues to shape societal ideals, often through their portrayal as warriors facing impossible odds with resilience and strength. While the gladiatorial games themselves have long disappeared, their essence remains embedded in modern understandings of human courage, the fight for personal freedom, and the concept of honor, values that remain central to contemporary narratives of struggle and success. The gladiator as a symbol of courage. The gladiator is often seen as a model of courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the Roman Empire, courage in the arena wasn't just about physical strength or combat skills, it was about mental fortitude and the ability to face almost certain death without flinching. Gladiators exemplified a form of courage that was both psychological and physical, testing their endurance, resolve, and ability to fight on despite suffering. In modern culture, this interpretation of gladiators as symbols of bravery resonates with the way we view individuals who face insurmountable challenges in other areas of life. Whether it's soldiers in combat, athletes overcoming injuries, or everyday people who battle personal difficulties, the idea of a gladiator spirit remains pervasive. They are often depicted as the ultimate embodiment of fighting for something greater, whether it be freedom, redemption, or a noble cause. In movies like Gladiator, the character Maximus represents the quintessential courageous hero. His willingness to fight, not for personal gain but for justice and revenge, makes him a symbol of honor and valor. Modern interpretations of courage often draw upon this archetype, where a person not only battles physical obstacles, but also faces moral dilemmas and psychological trauma, yet continues to rise despite those trials. Gladiators' ability to maintain their dignity and courage, even in the face of death, directly informs these values in modern storytelling. The gladiator and the fight for freedom, or the pursuit of it, is a central theme in the life of many gladiators. Most were forced into the arena as slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, with no choice but to fight for their survival. But for some, the arena presented a unique opportunity for freedom. Victorious gladiators, who performed well over time, were sometimes granted manumission freedom, or they could earn a reward of money or land. Gladiators who survived long enough, or became particularly famous, could earn their freedom through sponsorship or the approval of the Roman people or emperor. The gladiator's fight for freedom is in many ways a metaphor that resonates with modern struggles for personal autonomy, justice, and human rights. In the modern world, the gladiator's battle for freedom can be seen in the struggles of individuals who fight for social justice, civil rights, or political freedom. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi are often compared to gladiators because of their own battles against oppressive systems. These modern gladiators fought not in an arena, but in the public eye, facing their own forms of adversity, while struggling to break free from the systems of control that sought to undermine them. In popular culture, the fight for freedom remains a central narrative for many heroes, whether they are characters in historical fiction, superhero stories, or biographical drama. These heroes, much like gladiators, are portrayed as battling for their rights and freedoms, facing personal sacrifices and hardships in the process. Gladiators then serve as the symbolic forebearers of the modern quest for liberty and self-determination. Gladiators and the concept of honor. In ancient Rome, gladiators were often seen as figures of honor, though the nature of that honor was complex. To the Roman citizens, gladiators represented the ideals of virtue, manliness, which encompassed bravery, strength, and skill in battle. Even though they were slaves or criminals, gladiators were admired for their ability to fight in the arena, and in many cases, their death in battle was seen as a noble sacrifice. Honor in the context of gladiatorial combat was earned through courage, skill, and the ability to face death without fear. Gladiators who fought well and won the favor of the crowd could enjoy fleeting moments of glory. Their victories, whether they led to freedom or death, were often seen as the highest form of honor. Gladiators who performed with great skill or who fought against overwhelming odds were immortalized in Roman art, literature, and even in the records of the games themselves. This ideal of honor has survived into modern conceptions of heroism and valor. In films and literature, heroes are often depicted as individuals who act with honor, despite the personal cost. The modern hero, much like the gladiator, is someone who stands firm in the face of adversity, choosing to act out of a sense of duty, morality, or personal conviction. These ideals are often depicted in military films, superhero sagas, and stories of personal redemption, where the hero's sense of honor is paramount to their identity. The concept of honor extends beyond fiction into the realm of modern society, where it is associated with personal integrity and the courage to stand by one's principles. Gladiators as symbols of honor continue to inspire individuals who strive to live with dignity, even in the face of overwhelming odds or societal pressure. Gladiators in modern justice and sport. In the contemporary world, gladiators have been embraced as symbols of strength and resilience in various contexts, especially in justice and sport. Gladiatorial combat, while certainly a violent and oppressive institution, has influenced the way modern society perceives competition and struggle. In the realm of sports, gladiators are often depicted as athletes who undergo rigorous training and sacrifices for the sake of competition and victory. In the boxing ring, the football field, and even in mixed martial arts, MMA, athletes face intense physical challenges, often with little regard for personal safety, much like the gladiators of ancient Rome. These athletes, much like their ancient counterparts, are celebrated for their strength, endurance, and courage. In modern justice, the gladiatorial ideal has evolved into the concept of individuals who fight for justice in the courtroom or on the streets, battling not for personal gain but for the rights of others. Activists and lawyers who challenge systemic oppression, fight for civil rights, and stand up against corruption can be seen as modern-day gladiators in their own battles for freedom and justice. While modern justice no longer involves physical combat in an arena, the principles of courage, honor, and the fight for what is right remain central to the practice of law, social activism, and civil rights movement. The gladiator's legacy in this sense continues to inspire those who take up causes that seem impossible, yet fight on for a better, more just world. The final and most profound legacy of gladiators is the resilience of the human spirit. Despite being forced into an inhumane system of violent entertainment, gladiators endured unimaginable hardship and pushed through psychological and physical trauma. They fought not only for survival but for their dignity, their freedom, and sometimes for personal redemption. In modern terms, gladiators are often used as metaphors for anyone who faces extreme challenges. They are the individuals who, despite immense odds, continue to fight, survive, and ultimately triumph. Whether in the form of an athlete overcoming physical injuries, a survivor battling illness, or someone fighting against societal constraints, the gladiator's spirit of perseverance and strength remains an enduring symbol of human resilience. The gladiator's legacy has also had a significant influence on modern philosophy. Discussions on the human will, survival instincts, and the ethics of violence often draw on the gladiator's plight. Scholars have examined how gladiators as both victims and heroes represent the complexities of the human condition. The struggle for meaning and survival in a world that is often indifferent to personal suffering. In the end, the gladiator's fight symbolizes a universal struggle, the fight against adversity, the search for freedom, and the need for personal dignity. These ideals continue to shape modern conceptions of honor, justice, and courage, ensuring that the gladiator's legacy will endure for generations to come. The dark path to the arena. Let's start with how someone became a gladiator in the first place, because this is where the first major misconception lies. Most people think gladiators were volunteers seeking glory and riches. The vast majority were forced into this life through the most brutal circumstances imaginable. Picture this: you're a prisoner of war, captured during one of Rome's countless military campaigns. Your homeland has been conquered, your family possibly killed or enslaved, and now you're marched in chains hundreds of miles to Rome. But instead of being sent to work in mines or fields like most slaves, you're selected for something far worse: gladiator school. Why were you chosen? Maybe you showed exceptional fighting skills during your capture. Maybe you have the physical build the Romans prize: tall, muscular, intimidating. Or maybe you're simply unlucky enough to be from a warrior culture that the Romans find exotic and entertaining. But prisoners of war weren't the only source. Criminals condemned to death often had their sentences commuted to the arena. Though this was hardly mercy, they were called noxi, and they were essentially walking dead men, expected to die in spectacularly violent ways for the crowd's entertainment. And here's something that will shock you: some Romans actually volunteered. These were usually desperate men drowning in debt or seeking a way out of poverty. By becoming gladiators, they could potentially earn enough money to buy their freedom, if they survived long enough. But the odds were heavily stacked against them. The gladiator schools, training grounds of hell. Once selected, new gladiators were sent to training schools called ludi. These weren't schools in any sense we'd recognize. They were more like military prisons combined with intensive training camps, where the curriculum was violence and the graduation ceremony was potential death. The most famous of these schools was in Capua, where Spartacus himself trained before leading the most famous slave rebellion in history. But there were schools throughout the empire, each one a carefully controlled environment designed to transform men into killing machines. The training was absolutely brutal. New gladiators called novicius would train for months or even years before their first real fight. They'd wake before dawn and train until exhaustion, learning not just how to fight, but how to die with dignity, because death was always a very real possibility. They learned different fighting styles depending on their physical attributes and the entertainment value the trainers thought they could provide. Tall, strong men might become murmillo, heavily armored fighters with large shields and short swords. Smaller, quicker men might become rotarius, the famous net and trident fighters you've probably seen in movies. But here's what movies don't show you: the psychological conditioning was just as important as the physical training. Gladiators had to learn to suppress their natural survival instincts and fight with a theatrical flair that would entertain the crowd. They practiced specific moves, dramatic poses, and even rehearsed different ways to accept defeat and death. Living conditions: luxury prison or hell on earth. Now here's where things get really interesting, because the living conditions of gladiators reveal one of the most fascinating contradictions in Roman society. These men were simultaneously treated as valuable investments and expendable entertainment. Successful gladiators lived better than most Roman citizens. They ate high-quality food, lots of meat, which was expensive and rare for most people in the ancient world. They had access to medical care that was advanced for its time, including specialized doctors who understood treating combat injuries. Some even had personal trainers, massage therapists, and comfortable private quarters. Why the luxury treatment? Simple economics. Training a gladiator was expensive, and a skilled fighter represented a massive investment. Gladiator owners, called lanestier, couldn't afford to let their investments die from poor nutrition or preventable illness. But don't mistake this comfort for freedom. Even the most pampered gladiators lived in what was essentially a luxurious prison. They were guarded constantly, forbidden from leaving without permission, and reminded daily that they existed solely for others' entertainment and profit. The daily routine was rigid and exhausting. Wake at dawn, eat a carefully planned breakfast, train for hours in different combat scenarios, study tactics and techniques, practice showmanship, maintain their equipment, and then collapse into bed to repeat it all the next day. The gladiator diet, eating for death. The gladiator diet, eating for death. The gladiator diet was so specific and well documented that we know exactly what they ate, and it might surprise you. It wasn't the meat-heavy diet you might expect for warriors. Gladiators were sometimes called hordevieri, barley eaters, because their diet was heavy in grains, legumes and vegetables. They ate a lot of barley, beans, oats and ash. Yes, ash from burned plants, which provided calcium for strong bones. This diet served multiple purposes. It built bulk and muscle mass quickly, it was relatively cheap to provide in large quantities, and it created a layer of fat under the skin that would make wounds look more dramatic and bloody for the crowd without being immediately fatal. Think about that for a moment. Even their diet was designed around entertainment value and spectacle. These men weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting to provide the most visually exciting death possible. The gladiator schools had their own complex social hierarchies that determined everything from sleeping arrangements to training priorities. At the top were the veteran fighters who had survived multiple bouts and earned fame. These primate palace gladiators were celebrities, treated almost like modern sports stars within the confines of their prison. Below them were the promising newcomers who showed potential for stardom. These men received extra training, better equipment and more opportunities to prove themselves in the arena. At the bottom were the expendables, the criminals, the weak, the unlucky. These men were often used as practice opponents for the stars, or thrown into hopeless fights designed to be quick, brutal entertainment for the crowd. But here's what's fascinating. This hierarchy could change instantly based on performance in the arena. A single impressive fight could elevate a nobody to stardom overnight, while one poor performance could send a champion tumbling down the ranks. Gladiators would wake to a special pre-fight meal, possibly their last, and undergo elaborate preparation rituals that were part practical, part psychological, and part religious. They would pray to the gods, especially Mars, the god of war, and Nemesis, the goddess of revenge. Some would write final letters to loved ones, knowing they might not survive the day. Others would engage in superstitious rituals, wearing lucky charms, following specific routines, or making offerings to ensure divine protection. The preparation of equipment was crucial. A gladiator's gear wasn't just protective, it was part of his identity and his performance. The elaborate helmets, decorated shields, and specialized weapons were all designed to create a specific visual impact for the audience. But here's something movies never show accurately. The psychological pressure was enormous. These men knew that their lives depended not just on their fighting skills, but on their ability to entertain a bloodthirsty crowd. A boring fight could be a death sentence, even for the winner. The walk to death. Entering the arena. The moment a gladiator stepped into the arena, everything changed. The roar of the crowd, sometimes 50,000 people or more in the largest amphitheaters, was overwhelming. The smell of blood from previous fights, mixed with incense, and the sweat of packed humanity. Gladiators would enter in a formal procession, parading around the arena to display themselves to the crowd. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a psychological warfare tactic. The crowd would cheer for their favorites, and boo the fighters they wanted to see die. This immediate feedback told gladiators exactly what the audience expected from them. The famous phrase "Avau Caesar morituritas salutant," "Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you," was actually rarely used and only in specific circumstances, usually by condemned criminals, not professional gladiators. But the sentiment was always present. Every fighter knew death was a very real possibility. Combat, the deadly dance. The actual fighting was nothing like Hollywood depicts. Real gladiator combat was a careful balance between genuine skill, theatrical performance, and brutal reality. Fights could last anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, depending on the skill of the fighters and the entertainment value they provided. Different types of gladiators fought with specific weapons and armor combinations that created visual and tactical contrast. A heavily armored secutor might fight a lightly armed retiarius with net and trident. These matchups weren't random. They were carefully planned to create the most entertaining spectacle possible. The crowd played a crucial role in every fight. They would cheer for spectacular moves, gasp at near-death moments, and ultimately help decide the fate of defeated fighters. A gladiator who fought bravely and entertainingly, even in defeat, might earn the crowd's mercy. But here's the brutal truth. Mercy wasn't guaranteed, and death was always spectacular. When a gladiator died in the arena, it wasn't a quick, clean death. It was designed to be a dramatic, blood-soaked spectacle that would satisfy the crowd's bloodlust and serve as a warning to others. The thumbs-up myth. Everyone thinks they know about the thumbs-up or thumbs-down gesture that decided a gladiator's fate. But like so much about gladiators, the reality was more complex and more brutal than the myth. Modern historians aren't even certain exactly what gestures were used, but it definitely wasn't the simple thumbs up or down we see in movies. Some evidence suggests that a closed fist meant mercy, while a pointing gesture indicated death. Others believe the crowd would wave handkerchiefs or shout specific phrases. What we do know is that the emperor or the sponsor of the games had the final say, and they usually followed the crowd's wishes. Keeping the people happy was crucial for political survival in Rome. But sometimes, political considerations overrode crowd sentiment. An emperor might spare a fighter to demonstrate mercy, or condemn one to send a political message. Fixed fights and political theater. Here's one of the most shocking secrets about gladiator games. Many fights were fixed. Just like modern professional wrestling, gladiator combat often followed predetermined scripts designed to maximize entertainment value and political impact. Promoters would arrange fights to tell specific stories: the triumph of Roman virtue over foreign barbarism, the price of rebellion, or the reward for loyalty. Popular gladiators were too valuable to risk in truly random combat, so their fights were often choreographed to ensure they survived while still providing thrilling entertainment. This doesn't mean the fights were fake. The danger was very real, and mistakes could still be fatal. But the outcomes were often predetermined, and the gladiators were essentially actors in deadly political theater. The fix went deeper than individual fights. Entire games were designed to send political messages. Emperors would stage elaborate spectacles that reinforced their power, demonstrated Roman superiority, or distracted the population from political problems. The phrase "bread and circuses," keeping the people fed and entertained to prevent rebellion, was literal politics. This is one of the darkest aspects of gladiator life that's rarely discussed in popular media. Successful gladiators were often subjected to sexual exploitation that went far beyond their fighting duties. Wealthy Roman women, including some from the highest levels of society, would pay enormous sums for private encounters with famous gladiators. These men, already enslaved and powerless, were forced into prostitution as another form of entertainment for the wealthy elite. Some gladiators were even married off to wealthy women in elaborate ceremonies that were more like live entertainment than genuine marriages. These relationships were never equal. The gladiator remained property, and his wife was essentially renting him for her pleasure and social status. This sexual exploitation was so common that it became a source of scandal and moral panic among conservative Romans, who saw it as evidence of the corruption and decadence of their society. But it continued because it was enormously profitable for gladiator owners. Medical experiments and torture. Gladiator schools weren't just training facilities. They were also sites of primitive medical experimentation. Roman doctors used wounded gladiators as test subjects to advance their understanding of anatomy, surgical techniques, and pain management. This wasn't entirely callous. Gladiators needed medical care to remain valuable investments, but the treatment they received was often experimental and painful. They were subjected to untested surgical procedures, new medicines and treatments that were as likely to kill as cure. Some gladiators were kept alive with severe injuries specifically to serve as medical curiosities or teaching tools. Others were subjected to deliberate injuries to test new treatments. The line between medical care and torture was often non-existent. The economics of death. The gladiator industry was a massive economic enterprise built on human suffering. The costs involved were staggering. Training, feeding, housing, and equipping gladiators required enormous investments. But the profits were even more enormous. A single day of games could cost more than a year's salary for a typical Roman citizen. The most elaborate spectacles, lasting for days or weeks, could bankrupt entire cities or require imperial funding. But they generated even more wealth through gambling, concessions, and the political capital they provided. Gladiators themselves were traded like commodities. Successful fighters could be worth more than luxury villas or ships. They were bought, sold, rented, and used as collateral for loans. Their value fluctuated based on their fighting record, their entertainment value, and their physical condition. But here's the most disturbing part. The economic system was designed to ensure a steady supply of gladiators. Wars were fought partly to capture slaves for the arena. Criminal laws were designed to funnel more people into gladiator schools. The entire system required constant human sacrifice to sustain itself. The slim hope of freedom. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, some gladiators did achieve freedom. This could happen in several ways, each rare and requiring extraordinary circumstances. The most common path to freedom was through exceptional performance and popularity. A gladiator who consistently entertained crowds and survived numerous fights might eventually earn enough money to purchase his freedom. But this required not just skill and luck, but also the political savvy to navigate the complex relationships within the gladiator world. Some gladiators earned freedom as gifts from grateful emperors or wealthy patrons. This usually happened after particularly spectacular performances or as part of larger political gestures. But these gifts came with strings attached. Freed gladiators often remained dependent on their former owners for employment and protection. The most dramatic path to freedom was through rebellion, though this was almost always suicide. Spartacus's rebellion, the most famous example, ultimately failed despite initial successes, and the captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to others. Life after the arena. For the few gladiators who achieved freedom, life after the arena was often disappointing and dangerous. They had few skills beyond fighting, limited education, and were marked by their past as entertainment slaves. Some found work as bodyguards for wealthy Romans, trainers in gladiator schools, or soldiers in private armies. Others tried to blend into civilian life, but their scars and reputations often betrayed their past. Many freed gladiators struggled with what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. They had been conditioned to violence and trained to suppress normal emotional responses. Adjusting to peaceful civilian life was often impossible, and many returned to the arena voluntarily, unable to function in any other environment. The mental and emotional damage inflicted on gladiators was profound and lasting. These men were forced to kill or be killed for entertainment, often fighting friends and training partners they had lived alongside for years. The constant threat of death created a unique form of trauma. Gladiators lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance, never knowing when they might be selected for a fight they wouldn't survive. Sleep was difficult, relationships were impossible, and hope was a luxury few could afford. Many gladiators developed elaborate coping mechanisms, religious obsessions, superstitious rituals, or complete emotional numbness. Others broke under the pressure, becoming violent, unpredictable, or completely withdrawn. The suicide rate among gladiators was high, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Some chose to die by their own hands, rather than provide entertainment for Roman crowds. Others engaged in deliberately self-destructive behavior that amounted to slow suicide. What gladiators reveal about Roman society? The gladiator system wasn't just entertainment, it was a mirror that reflected the deepest values, fears and contradictions of Roman civilization. Understanding gladiators means understanding Rome itself, and what we see isn't pretty. Roman society was built on hierarchy, violence, and the exploitation of the powerless. The arena was simply the most visible and dramatic expression of these values. Romans could watch human beings fight to the death while eating luxury foods and wearing fine clothes, because they had created a society that dehumanized anyone who wasn't a Roman citizen. But the gladiator games also revealed Roman anxiety. The popularity of foreign fighters reflected both fascination with and fear of the barbarian cultures Rome was conquering. The elaborate rules and rituals around combat showed a society trying to control and domesticate the very violence it was built on. The sexual exploitation of gladiators revealed the hypocrisy of Roman moral values. A society that prided itself on discipline, virtue and family values was simultaneously built on slavery, sexual exploitation and public brutality. The end of an era. The gladiator games didn't end suddenly. They gradually declined over several centuries as Roman society changed and Christianity spread throughout the empire. Christian emperors increasingly viewed the games as incompatible with their religious values, though the transition was slow and incomplete. Economic factors also played a role. The cost of maintaining the gladiator system became prohibitive as the empire faced increasing military and financial pressures. Wars, plagues, and political instability made it harder to justify spending enormous sums on entertainment. But perhaps most importantly, the gladiator games lost their political function. As the Roman Empire became more bureaucratic and less dependent on popular support, emperors no longer needed to buy the loyalty of the masses with spectacular entertainment. The last recorded gladiator fight took place in 45 CE, over 400 years after the height of the games. By then, the Roman Empire itself was in its final decline, and the world that had created and sustained the gladiator system was disappearing. Legacy and modern parallels. The gladiator system ended over 1500 years ago, but its legacy continues to influence how we think about entertainment, violence, and human nature. Modern combat sports, reality television, and even social media all contain echoes of the arena. We still gather to watch human beings inflict violence on each other. For entertainment, we still create celebrities out of people who perform in dangerous or degrading situations. We still use entertainment to distract from political and social problems. The gladiator system was an extreme example of human exploitation disguised as entertainment, but the fundamental dynamics, powerful people profiting from the suffering of powerless people, while crowds cheer, remain depressingly familiar. Conclusion: 18 minutes 20 minutes. The truth behind the legend. So what was it really like to be a gladiator in ancient Rome? It was to live as a piece of property, whose only value was the entertainment you could provide through your suffering and potential death. It was to be simultaneously pampered and brutalized, celebrated and dehumanized, valuable and completely expendable. Gladiators weren't heroes or warriors in any meaningful sense. They were victims of a system designed to transform human misery into profit and political power. They were slaves forced to kill and die for the amusement of people who saw them as less than human. But they were also human beings who found ways to maintain dignity, friendship and hope in the most hopeless circumstances imaginable. They created their own culture, their own values, and their own forms of resistance, within a system designed to destroy their humanity. The stories we tell about gladiators today, tales of honor, courage and noble combat, are largely fantasy. The reality was much darker, more complex and more disturbing than any Hollywood movie could show. Why this matters today? Understanding the reality of gladiator life isn't just about correcting historical misconceptions. It's about understanding human nature and the dangers of societies built on exploitation and entertainment. The Romans weren't uniquely evil or barbaric. They were human beings who created systems that allowed them to profit from and enjoy human suffering, while maintaining the belief that they were civilized and virtuous. They found ways to justify the unjustifiable and normalize the Every society faces the temptation to create its own version of the arena, systems that exploit the powerless for the entertainment of the powerful, while disguising this exploitation as something noble, necessary, or entertaining. The gladiators of ancient Rome are gone, but the systems that created them live on in different forms. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward building a world where human beings aren't treated as expendable entertainment for others' profit and pleasure. Final thoughts. The next time you see a movie about gladiators, or visit the ruins of an ancient amphitheater, remember that these weren't stages for heroic adventures. They were sites of systematic human exploitation on a massive scale. The blood in the sand was real. The suffering was real. And the people who died there were real human beings with hopes, fears and dreams that were cut short for someone else's entertainment. That's the truth about what being a gladiator in ancient Rome was really like. And now you know why the reality is so much more disturbing than the legend. If this video opened your eyes to the dark reality behind the gladiator myth, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shocking truths hidden in history. And let me know in the comments, what other historical legends would you like to see exposed? Because trust me, there are plenty more lies that Hollywood and history books have been telling us for way too long.